Welcome to episode 19 of And Also, where Kirk Steigler and I not only look at the previous week's sermon, but we also do a kind of metaphorical grab bag of sorts of different topics and ideas and thoughts. Talk sports.
Never.
Sports talk. Yeah, we talk about everything under the sun.
Deep discussions on bowling.
Except for sports. Oh, that's funny. So, welcome to the anti-sports podcast, or not anti-sports. Let's strike that. Let's say the absentee sports. That's true. Absentee sports podcast, also known as also known as episode 19. We are picking it up from the first sermon in a series called Glue, where I preached last week, and I talked about the introduction to the book of First John, where John talks about what he and the other disciples have seen and heard and experienced being the person of Jesus, and how they take that and say our fellowship is with God and with one another. And so the idea was that our direction is toward Christ, but then we do that together. That when John encounters Christ, he doesn't just do it in isolation. He does that through and with community. So that's the introduction, not only of the series, not only of the sermon, not only of the podcast, but also of episode 19. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kirk to fill in all of the blanks, including whatever sports references he would like to make.
Wow.
Any sports references on the table?
Jarts.
That would be... I have a Jarts story, in fact. I'll save it for another time.
Perfect.
I did grow up in the 80s, after all.
Same. Yeah. All right. So, yeah. Skipping ahead from Jarts. Looking at this, otherwise our listener will get lost. But
that's true. On track.
The thing that I found fascinating just in the opening, right? This is the opening words of First John, right? So there's a Gospel of John, there's this series of books of John, there's Revelation, but I just am fascinated by his perspective versus the other disciples. So Luke, we get a long list of here's who he was related to, right? Talking about Jesus. This is the definition of his origins. And we get that long list, very descriptive, putting him in place relative to other humans. And then when you get to John, now we're a little mystical. And when I say a little, I mean like existential. And it fascinates me that that's where he goes right off the bat in his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, right?
Yeah.
And then here, right off the bat, again, it's the Word and the life, right? This is where he starts.
Yeah.
And I am fascinated with that his perspective on who Jesus was, right? He's the beloved disciple. So Jesus understood that he understood this way, that he saw this way. That Jesus is the embodiment, the physical presence of the life, the word of life, right? Which is what he says at the end of verse 1, right? Then at verse 2 is the life appeared. And we have seen it and testified to it. And that just is fascinating to me that he understands that the life spoken forth at the point of creation has shown up, and that is the life that redeems everyone in the end. That's amazing. That's how he sees it, and that's how he presents it. Which, at the time, I'm pretty sure this 2 English translation is probably a little rough compared to how the listeners at the time might have understood. That whole first opening salvo of 4 verses is pretty lofty.
why do you think? Because now I'm thinking in context of John 1. Because you're right. In the beginning was the Word, and now we have that which was from the beginning. So in John 1, Jesus isn't mentioned. I'd have to go and look at it, but just off the beat, he's not mentioned until verse 18 or 19, I don't think, by name.
Right.
He's referenced the Word is with God, the Word was God, he was with God in the beginning.
Entity is mentioned.
Correct. And then so that's almost, and I know that's not what John the writer's doing, but it's almost a like it's not intended to, but it's almost like a removal of a degree, like Jesus becomes an objective role, the Word. And even in First John 1, he's the Word, he's the life. That which we have seen, that which in Jesus comes up in the Word, the name Jesus comes up in verse 3. Our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son, with his Son Jesus Christ. But the object of the sentence is the Father, or actually is the fellowship.
Right.
And Jesus is secondary in the, even though he's talking about Jesus, he's still in the passage. It's a fellowship with the Father and with his Son Jesus. So how does that reconcile with John being the beloved disciple? So John in the gospel, even now, even in the first couple of verses here, it is very personal, that which we have seen, that which we have talked. Even the book of John is all very relational, very personal. But it's almost like in the introduction to both these books, 1 John 1 and John 1, it's almost like he's putting Jesus at a distance. That's the way it feels to me. Why? So how do you reconcile? Why do you think that is?
That's interesting. You see it as a distance, because I don't. I see it as he's amazed that the presence of God was physically embodied in front of him.
So he's taking that which is objectively true about Christ, and he's saying, "Look, he's here."
He came down and had to hide in this human costume.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think, I wonder about that too, because at the moment, as Jesus is dying, right, he's on the cross and says to John, "This is your mother."
Right.
And the way that Mary prays about and thanks God for her pregnancy, where she understands that she is the physical carrier of the life of God, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if the two of them had some sort of understanding in a way that the rest of the disciples don't. Like
John and Jesus, you mean?
The way that John and Mary saw Jesus.
I see. Okay.
That is an interesting. Who knows?
So do you think they had? So do you think John and Mary, Jesus' mother,
Yeah.
had a more clear perspective on who Jesus was from the beginning versus like Peter, who got it obviously, but didn't get it right. Didn't really know what.
Gets it later.
Yeah, he doesn't really know what to do.
Even then, a little clumsily, but yeah.
Yeah, because they don't, even most of the disciples don't really know quite what to make of Jesus, even though they're following him. They become his disciples, as a rabbi would have, but they're like, hey, Rabbi, should we call on fire from heaven, or at the Transfiguration?
Should I build the shack?
Yeah, Peter's like, what should I build here? Like, so it's like they don't really fully know what to do with Jesus. Do you think John and Mary have, like, they're like, no, we know who? Even Judas, I mean, he doesn't really understand Jesus' mission.
Judas, trying to kick something off, but
yeah.
the beautiful part about this idea that John and Mary have an understanding of a more existential reality embodied as Jesus is the moment when Mary then is like, go ask my son to make wine out of water over in the foot washing water.
That's such
Because now you have this person who has this deep understanding, and moments earlier in the passages, right, not that far before, you get this, the big, prayer about how grateful and how amazing, and then, hey, go make some wine. Mom!
No, not yet.
Not yet. All right, fine.
Then he acquiesces to her.
Yeah.
To her.
Well, and this is the first time it's logged, right? So she's pretty casual with it, which makes me think that this was happening around the house. This broke. Hey, all right, fine. I just wonder, like, how often
Jesus,
this was happening.
hey, can you come here a second?
Yeah.
I need you to fix this.
Yeah. All right.
That's-
You know what we could really use? Not again.
I mean, that is a great.
Who knows?
That is a great line when
Yeah.
Mary gets it, when Mary chooses to get involved.
Yeah.
Where he's like no, and then she tells the servants like just do whatever he tells you. Like she knows that he's gonna.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So like I'm even thinking now about and I wouldn't I'm not stating, I don't think you are either, that John and Mary had some like extra revelatory understanding of Jesus necessarily. I think Mary did, I would say, because Mary knew prophetically what she was dealing with. She was visited by angels. So I will say Mary understood because she was visited by angels. Joseph was. Other than that, none of the disciples were, to say this is who Jesus is. But John, we don't have record of him having extra kind of revelatory knowledge. However, so now there's a
But
little.
he's the guy who writes Revelation.
Well, like, and I don't know what to do with this. So I'm kind of chasing a thought without an end, and that could be dangerous. So I think about in John 21. I think I'm not looking at it, so this is from my memory. 2021, something like that. When Peter's being reinstated, right? Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?
Yeah.
Right. That whole story. And then Peter compares himself, or tries to compare himself to John. He looks over at John, who we think is John. What about him? And it's the beloved disciple. We assume it's John. And Peter's like, well, what about him? What are you going to do with him? And Jesus is like, well, that's none of your business. And so John kind of there and one or two other places kind of gets picked out as he's in the inner circle. So is Peter, James, and John. But he kind of gets picked out as being like the other, like there's something different about him compared to the rest. I don't know. It's interesting to think about what he was privy to, and again, not as something that that he had that other people didn't, but maybe there's something that he just clearly understood about Christ that gets kind of expounded upon in John, the gospel, but then also his letters, also Revelation. That was a revelation. But I don't know. It's just interesting. I've never thought about John's own personal perspective and how it differed from the disciples.
Yeah. But he still fell asleep in Gethsemane.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, it was a long day. So.
Yeah, nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
But, yeah. The other thing is you don't really hear, except for the Transfiguration, you don't really hear about getting called out to do something like uniquely pulled aside for a huddle.
Yeah, that's true.
There isn't that. I'm teaching the disciples, I am teaching the crowds.
Right.
The disciples are called upon to serve the crowds. Yeah, there isn't the one-on-one discipleship listed.
Right.
So the perspective of the person that you're walking with, right? Because they're marching around all over Israel together for 3 years. And in that span of time, a perspective is formed that congeals into something that you can write about uniquely. A perspective, right?
Different than, yeah.
Right? One of the sons of thunder, right? I love that title. Right. That's such a great. All right, and then the mom begging, who's going to sit on the right and the left.
That's true. Yeah.
But amazing to end up there and to see things that way, to see the story behind the story in front of you. Which is the gospel, right? Which is what Peter had been missing. So Peter sees the reality of physical in front of him, which is why he cuts off the ear, right?
He sees Jesus as a physical power, even like an over.
He sees, he reacts to, and feels and does the most human out of all of everybody, right? In that list,
that's true.
right? The guy who does and says the oops stuff, which we all do,
The hoop stuff.
right? All of us would do that. Maybe not all of us would cut somebody's ear off, but
Fair. You feel like it.
There's moments, right, where you ah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Peter gets to see it as me, like I've been asked to follow.
Mm.
I'm a fisherman. I like fishing.
Mm.
I'm asked to follow this guy. What does it all mean? I don't even know.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just do whatever he asks me to and do my best. But first of all, to have his name changed from Simon to Peter, right?
Yeah.
So, and be told, you're the rock I'm going to build the church on, right? Huh? Okay, I'm building stuff now, right? I'm sure that he's thinking very physical. But to John, everything is, he sees the other layer, and he sees...
Which is why the Gospel of John is so filled with miracles, because it's just a different perspective altogether.
Yeah.
You get... Yeah, it's interesting.
You get to... He sees that this layer, there's the light inside the lamp, right?
Right.
We see the shade, and he saw the light.
So do you say... So would you chop that up to personality? Like that was John's personality? Because you can't make definitive statements about personality, but you can get a sense of this is what Peter was like, this is what John was like, or even Matthew, Mark, and Luke, just because the way they wrote, and the things that they chose to write about versus, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, very different than John. So would you... And James, right? Yeah, James is, it's, I mean, so do you get a sense, or I guess, how would you respond to it being an understanding of who Christ is that caused him to write in the way he did, or his personality kind of caused him to see things differently than Peter, or whomever, or James? But
I mean, I think that's the beautiful thing about the disciples that were picked, is that those were and then there were many hangers-on who scattered later but came back. But the disciples that are chosen, the 12, right, are chosen deliberately.
Mm.
And each one really different from the other.
Yeah.
A doctor, a fisherman, a bunch of fishermen actually.
Tax collector. Yeah.
Right? You get all these, just brother, right?
Right, yeah.
You get, folks from different walks of life.
Yeah.
And folks, everybody has a different perspective based on, we all can view the same event differently and that kind of a thing. So being able to walk along, witness, and how you see it, and then it has to you have to be able to run that past your fellow disciples, because he's not writing in a vacuum.
And I would say, like even kind of circling into that idea of like encountering God and then encountering God in community is one of the most amazing things about the scripture. And I know there's the Gospel of Thomas and there's extra biblical gospels, we all know that, but there's clear issues with those gospels as far as like what's spoken or written. But that said, is you have these gospels, you have all these letters, and they do span years, decades probably. So and they do span personalities because they're all different. They do span professions, but they all work together. It's not written in a vacuum, and that's the most amazing thing, that it's not written in a vacuum, and it still meshes. Like it's not.
I love that. Yeah, it still meshes, and some of these letters are just like, "Hey guys," that's right.
Yeah,
and they're nothing more than that, but still, "Hey guys, reminder."
Just want to let you know.
Yeah.
Memo.
Yeah. It's just to know that there's a theme that gets carried through perpetually. And that theme can be seen from different ways, but still be the one thing.
Right.
It's,
Oh, that's good, yeah.
Right? So it's the one thing, but different viewpoints on the same singular thing.
So even taking the four gospels in, just as an example, so you can read. So we're talking about John. So you can read Mark. Mark's very action oriented.
Yeah.
He says immediately Jesus was immediately Jesus. Oh, it's like an action movie. He's always doing. It's all the stuff that Jesus did. Very different than John. But you can read. Did I say Matthew or Mark? No,
You
no.
said Mark was
Yeah, Mark. Yeah, okay, so I'm right. So you can read Mark, but which is very different than John, the Gospel of John, not the letter of. But reading Mark doesn't discount what John said, nor is reading John doesn't discount it. It all gets to the same place, even though they're vastly different. So it's like you can read these different letters, which I mean, this example bleeds into the church. You can as we encounter Christ, my encounter of Christ, if done under the authority of Jesus, done under the work and word, doesn't take away from anybody else's. It only adds to. Reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together only builds the story. It doesn't. There's not one that neglects the other for reading it, even though they're incredibly different. They'll get back to that one thing, and they work better than as you understand them together.
It fascinates me too when you think about how the Bible's put together. That these are four individual perspectives, letters written to introduce this is what happened.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of writing, first of all, but to try to sum up 3 years of experience plus what you've heard stories about.
Right.
So no one was there when Jesus was a little kid, but
Right.
we hear about it. Right?
Yeah.
It's written down about, there's Jesus running around the temple, sneaking off from the parents, and the parents are running around frantic throughout a city trying to find their kid
Right.
for a couple of days. That's amazing.
That Jesus had no problem with.
No problem, and
Right.
nobody talks about like stayed at a hotel, right? Got food.
Yeah.
None of that's discussed. It's just like running around for a few days trying to find my kid. But that gets logged because it's notable, probably.
Yeah.
We don't hear about other events much earlier than that,
Right.
other than the birth of. Because that's a notable event.
Right.
Because wise men show up, and shepherds and angels, and holy moly, that's a lot. But it's interesting that what gets noted in the earlier section. So those stories had to have been told.
Right.
But then what is witnessed is the descriptions of what is witnessed.
Yeah.
And the perspectives of how things went down is
Yeah.
always really interesting. And I wonder the impact of the Holy Spirit. We see it change Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Like his perspective radically changes as
Yeah.
time goes on, right? There's the kill and eat moment where he's like,
Right, that's true.
That whole, I can't do that. That breaks the rules. And what rules?
Let's say you
Yeah. What are these rules? Those rules are gone. It's just interesting to see the change and when it occurs, and then to see that from as far as we can tell, John's view doesn't change too much. I don't think. It gets enhanced. I think, maybe even accelerated.
Yeah, as we get to Revelation.
Well, Revelation, different thing, but
That's true.
talking
That's
about
true.
just his perspective on who
Yeah.
Jesus is. I can't really recall one story where, other than, sitting at a table and hearing about, him leaning in, I don't recall anything else where John is talking about who Jesus is to any of the other disciples. It's only in the gospel and his letters.
Well, what's interesting is that you're right. As you were talking, I was thinking about that same thing. I'm like Peter. There's all sorts of biographical information
From all the disciples.
from everybody.
Everybody's like, Peter, oh my gosh.
Everybody's got a Peter story. Like,
Yeah.
dude, believe this guy? Whereas John was kind of like apparently just hanging out at dinner most of the time because you don't get a lot of
Not a lot of Andrew stories.
you don't get a lot of John stories. I'm looking up a verse right now, because I think Uh, who does Peter rebuke in Galatians? Is it James or John? That's what I was trying to figure out.
Oh, that's a good question.
That's what I'm looking at. But I forget off the bat. Because that's the only, if it is John, although I think it's James.
I think it's James.
I'm reading it right now, but well, James, this is Galatians 2, verse 9, and when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised.
Well, this is now Peter talking to Paul talking to Peter, right? Where he's saying, "Hey, well, how come you don't eat with the Gentiles?"
That's Paul and that's Paul and Peter. You're right. That's what I'm getting.
Because that's a big moment too.
Where Paul gets,
which is kind of funny to imagine, because again, right? Peter's the oops guy,
right?
But when Peter's doing things, he's still following the rules all the time, and God's always trying to kick him off that. Yeah. Hey, and then this moment comes where Paul is like, well, "What in the world?
Right?
You were just with these guys, and now you won't eat with them. What's happening here?"
That's true. He always just defaults to the rules. Yeah, I got the names mixed up, of course, but that is. But even just thinking about John, there's a little bit of biographical right there where John was there, but you don't really hear anything about him. Whereas Peter, you hear a ton about. So yeah, John's perspective, it's not like it's arrived, because you see Peter change. You're right. Like, back to your point, you see Peter change entirely. Like,
which is what is beautiful about his addition to the story. He is us, and he goes from bumbling to by the end gets it right.
Right, but it takes him
it takes his lifetime.
It does, and I think you're right. That's what's so wonderful about him is you're like, oh, like through with the vision. Go to the Acts 10 or with the vision. 3 times it happens. And so, like, if I saw a vision of, like, a sheet with all sorts of animals and God saying to me, "Rise, kill, and eat," I hope by the first time I get it, but it'd probably take me 3 or 4 times. And
right?
so just like
you'd be like, no. Apparently I'm hungry.
Yeah. God's like, oh, do I have to do this again? Like, okay, Peter. So, Peter he's the most human. He's, at least we kind of get the most information about him, and, like, you relate. Whereas John, there's an immediate depth in all of his writings. It's like, not that he's always arrived, but he writes that way. Like, he's always just had this.
But the nice thing that happens there is, even though that passage just kicks off really existential.
Yeah.
That in the end of that block of 4 verses, it's an invitation.
Yeah.
To come and join that perspective.
That's good. Yeah.
Right? So even though it starts out so lofty and so this is not how you and I view the world, right? As we're walking along doing our whatever's going on in our lives, he sees this. He sees through the facade of the world, of life all around us, and sees the life beaming out of it.
Yeah.
And then says, "But come on in.
Right.
Our joy will be complete.
Yeah.
You and I.
Yeah.
Our joy will be complete when you can jump in and join this perspective."
That's good.
So, I mean, that's awesome to know that he sees the world in such a different way, and it fills him with joy.
Right, and you're right. Because this could, I think of the Desert Fathers, who in the kind of the first century, where they went off, and again, like, this is part of Christian history, but when they went off and spent 20 years in caves alone and so on, where I'm not discounting those experiences, but because we've the church has gained from some of those experiences. However, like, that's kind of that kind of solitary cave-like existence, Saint Anastasius and others, it's the only one that I can think of. But you get, like, that kind of life. That's verses 1 and 2. but then you get to your point, that which we have seen and heard we proclaim to you also, that you may have fellowship with us. And indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son. So not to discount the Desert Fathers, but like John has that whole perspective, that whole kind of solitary encounter with God, but then he's like, oh, by the way,
It's for all of
it's
us.
for like you can be a part of it too. Like there's a that, and so that our joy may be complete. Like I don't think you can oversell that point, but that's a big deal that he's saying like this happens together. That's
I
you're right. He
also
brings it right down to the human level. It's great.
I like the idea too that he has an incomplete joy. What does that even feel like? You have some joy? What is incomplete joy? But
It's like half filled.
yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
What is that? But the fact that he can see that, he can feel it, and he describes it as I saw it, I heard it, I touched it.
Right. Right.
This was here. We witnessed this. And he says we, right? So he's talking about
Right.
the fellow disciples. We witnessed this. We were there. We did these things. We saw these things. We saw the power of God's life through Jesus present. And then, and we realized who was among us really.
Right.
And we want to share that with everyone. Come on in.
This isn't just mine. It's ours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I like that switch from that that more existential, alone, solitary, encountery kind of thing into no, this is normal and we do this in fellowship with one another.
Yeah.
Like, it almost yeah.
But I mean, it's beyond fellowship with one another. He also says, and we're in fellowship with the Father
at the same time.
at the same time,
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah. That's cool.
And you can jump in on this too. We're waiting for you.
Right.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And that's 4 verses. That's,
Right.
That's
Well,
humongous.
And I think there's a theme that we keep coming back to, like, we talk about so many different things.
Mostly sports.
Mostly sports metaphors, yes, yeah, and team scores. Go team. It's go sports team.
Do the sports.
Go do the sports. But we keep coming back to like we just spent 40 minutes here looking at 4 verses, and we're just again scratching the surface, just kind of the depth that Scripture offers us. That becomes really it just becomes this, I guess, a real life example of here's we just pick a scripture and again, just for background information, Kirk and I talked Sunday brief, but it was just, hey, do you want to get together Tuesday? But we don't talk
And also, there's hamburgers outside. That was
and
the
there were
other-
hamburgers, so forget talking. We gotta go eat. But the reality is we don't prepare for we just show up and we talk about what's on our minds from the
We're
passage.
completely unprepared.
Yeah, and then we can fill 40 minutes or however long just on 4 verses, and
sports metaphors.
it just speaks to the depth of the Scriptures. It's been
Yeah.
what?
And sports metaphors.
Well, that's given. That's a given 50% of our time. That's
But yeah, I mean, and I'm sure, and again, because of translation issues, right?
yeah.
From our perspective, we have to really poke at this to try to fathom what it means. But I wonder what reader just got all of it. Was there someone? I mean, oh wow, that must be amazing.
Yeah. Just to understand it.
In the original, whatever original, reading of that, they went,
Yeah.
yeah, right off the bat, because it's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, or hearing it as he's writing to the church.
Yeah.
And just hearing him say that, or hearing whoever's reading that say that. So, well, we'll end it at this point, and kind of an abrupt ending, but I think good, because that fits kind of our rhythm. We just kind of go from piece to piece to piece, like segment to segment to segment to segment to done. That's it. And then,
Slam the door shut.
and so I think it's just helpful if we say, like, all right, segment, we're done. We have not at all satisfied 1 John 1 through 4. There's plenty more, but I feel like it was really good to talk about it for 40, now maybe 5 minutes, half of which is filled with sports metaphors, of course.
Yeah, of course.
I was going to try and end the podcast with a sports metaphor, but I can't even think of one.
I have one sports related question,
Oh, ask it, because I'll
Which-
answer it for sure.
which is when you see a deodorant that's marked sport scent,
Yeah.
what is that?
Locker room smell.
Is it?
I don't know.
I don't know. What
I-
does that smell like?
I don't-
It's just a bizarre idea to me.
On that note,
Yeah.
thanks for joining us, and we'll leave you that one to ponder. What does the sports scent smell like?